The most dangerous moment in the galaxy is not when an alien queen raises her army. It is when she refuses to look at you. Daniel Carter learned that on a frozen rock 3 billion miles past the nearest Terran trade route, where the wind carried shards of ice across the steel hull of an abandoned research outpost, and the temperature outside hovered around -40 degrees Fahrenheit. His breath fogged the cracked visor of his repair helmet as he crouched beside a half-open reactor panel, fingers moving carefully through a nest of glowing circuits, while the old station groaned softly in the wind like a tired animal that refused to die. Daniel had spent the last 6 months alone on this frontier world, salvaging broken tech from ships that wandered too far into unmapped space, selling the parts to passing cargo crews just often enough to keep his battered shuttle flying and his coffee supply from running out. Life out here was simple: broken machines, cold nights, and long stretches of silence that let a man think too much about the past he'd left behind. The silence ended when the sky split open with blue light. Daniel looked up just in time to see a massive starship descend through the clouds, its curved hull glowing like molten silver against the dark sky as ion thrusters burned through the storm. He muttered under his breath, wiping frost from the station window. Ships didn't come this far unless they were lost or important. The vessel landed 200 yards from the outpost, sending a wave of powdered ice rolling across the ground like desert sand. Daniel stepped outside, pulling his jacket tighter against the wind, boots crunching across frozen gravel as the ship's ramp slowly lowered with a deep mechanical hiss. That was when he saw her. She stepped down from the ship with the calm certainty of someone who had never once questioned her place in the universe. Nearly 7 feet tall, skin glowing faintly blue beneath the storm light, long silver hair moving in the wind like liquid metal. Armor shaped from interlocking plates curved around her shoulders and waist, elegant rather than threatening, as if even battle had to obey royal protocol. Behind her stood a line of silent alien soldiers, but Daniel barely noticed them because the woman at the center carried something far heavier than authority. She carried gravity. Every movement pulled the world's attention toward her. Her golden eyes turned toward Daniel for half a second, and then immediately away. Not in anger, not in disgust. She simply looked past him as if focusing on the horizon instead. Daniel raised an eyebrow. That was strange. Most aliens who met humans for the first time either stared like they discovered a new species of animal or kept their weapons pointed just in case. But this woman didn't do either. She just refused to look at him again. The wind howled between them as Daniel shoved his hands in his pockets and gave a casual shrug. "Well," he called across the ice, voice echoing against the hull of the starship. "If you came all this way just to ignore me, Your Majesty, you probably could have saved a lot of fuel." The soldiers stiffened slightly, but the queen didn't react. She continued studying the distant mountains instead of the man standing 10 yards away. Daniel tilted his head, watching her more carefully now. Because the strange part wasn't that she avoided his eyes. The strange part was that, without ever looking directly at him, she had positioned herself exactly 5 steps closer than before. Daniel Carter had met hundreds of aliens in his life as a salvage engineer, traders, scientists, even a few diplomats who passed through the outer systems, but none of them had ever behaved like this. The woman standing in the snow 10 yards away clearly knew exactly where he was. Yet she continued to examine the distant mountains as if he were nothing more than another piece of equipment scattered across the outpost yard. The wind carried the sharp scent of frozen metal and ion fuel from the landed starship, while thin crystals of ice drifted through the air like dust. Daniel shifted his weight inside his boots, the cold already creeping through the soles, and studied the group more carefully. The soldiers behind her were tall, armored, disciplined, each one watching him closely with calm alertness, but their attention was nothing compared to the strange gravity of the woman in front. Even without looking at him, she controlled the entire moment. Daniel cleared his throat and spoke again, voice steady despite the freezing air. "I am guessing introductions are not your favorite activity." The soldiers exchanged subtle glances, but the queen finally moved. Not toward him. Instead, she turned slightly to the side, golden eyes still angled away as if studying the frost building along the outpost wall. Her voice, when it came, was calm and surprisingly quiet, carrying easily across the wind without any need for force. Daniel Carter. Daniel blinked once. Well, that was unexpected. Most people out here did not know his name unless they owed him money or needed their engines repaired. That is me, he replied slowly. And you have the advantage because I have no idea who you are. A pause followed, long enough for the wind to whistle through the broken antenna above the station roof. Then one of the soldiers stepped forward half a pace, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, but the Queen lifted a single hand, and the soldier immediately stopped. Finally she spoke again. Lysera of the Orinth Dominion. Daniel let out a low whistle. Even someone who spent most of his time alone with broken machinery recognized that name. Entire shipping routes shifted their course when the Orinth Royal Fleet traveled through a sector. Well, that explains the parking job, he said, nodding toward the massive starship resting in the snow behind her. Most people who land on my front yard are usually desperate miners or lost cargo pilots. It is not every day a queen stops by my repair shop. The soldiers clearly did not appreciate the humor, but Lysera did something strange. She took another small step forward, still without looking at him. Daniel noticed it immediately. The distance between them had quietly shrunk from 10 yards to maybe 8. Close enough now that he could see the faint shimmer in her skin, almost like soft light beneath water. He crossed his arms, curiosity slowly replacing surprise. Let me guess, he said. Your ship is having trouble. There was another short silence. Then Lysera spoke again, her voice softer this time, almost thoughtful. Our navigation array malfunctioned during atmospheric entry. Daniel nodded once, already picturing the problem in his head. Happens more often than people think when a ship jumps through unstable fields. Easy enough fix if you have the right tools. The wind shifted, carrying a faint warmth from the open engine vents of the royal ship. For the first time since landing, Lysera turned her head slightly toward him. Not fully, just enough that he caught the edge of those golden eyes in his peripheral vision. And yet, even now, she still did not truly look at him. Daniel Carter watched the alien queen for several quiet seconds, the wind pushing long ribbons of snow across the frozen ground between them, while the massive royal starship hummed softly behind her like a sleeping machine that had not quite decided whether to trust the planet beneath it. Most people missed small movements during conversations, but Daniel spent his life reading broken machines and subtle patterns, and he noticed something strange about the way Lysera stood. Every time he shifted even slightly, her position adjusted just a few inches as well, careful and controlled, as if an invisible line connected them, and she was quietly measuring the distance. He scratched the side of his jaw thoughtfully and glanced past her toward the open service hatch along the lower hull of the ship. The metal panels there were still warm enough to melt the snow around them, leaving a dark circle on the ground that slowly steamed in the freezing air. Navigation array failure during entry usually meant the internal guidance rings had misaligned, which was not catastrophic, but definitely inconvenient if a royal fleet had somewhere important to be. Daniel gave a slow nod and pulled his gloves tighter around his fingers. Well, Your Majesty, he said with a calm shrug, if the navigation array is drifting, then you are lucky you landed here instead of 300 miles north, because there is nothing up there but ice and old satellite debris, and I doubt your engineers want to spend the week digging through frozen scrap. One of the soldiers shifted slightly as if ready to respond, but again the Queen lifted her hand and silence returned. Daniel walked a few steps toward the ship, boots crunching on the frost-covered gravel, stopping just outside the faint heat radiating from the engine vents. He glanced back at her over his shoulder. I have tools inside the outpost and a diagnostics rig that still works most days as long as the power grid behaves. He gestured casually toward the low metal structure behind him, where dim, orange light glowed through the cracked windows. You are welcome to use it if you want the problem fixed before the next storm rolls through, because according to the weather scanner we have about 8 hours before the sky decides to get unfriendly again. For a moment Lysera did not move. The wind pulled strands of her silver hair across the glowing blue surface of her armor, while the soldiers behind her remained perfectly still, like statues carved from metal and ice. Then she spoke again, voice calm and measured. Your assistance was not requested. Daniel smiled faintly at that, and leaned one shoulder against the outer hull of the ship. That may be true, he replied, but I noticed something interesting about your landing pattern. The thruster alignment compensated 3 times during descent, which means your ship tried to correct the navigation drift automatically. That system only activates when the internal array cannot lock onto a stable coordinate grid. He tapped the hull lightly with his gloved knuckles and continued in the same relaxed tone. Which means right now the most advanced royal starship in this sector cannot calculate a safe jump route until someone realigns the guidance rings manually. The silence that followed was slightly different this time. Not tense. Curious. Daniel pushed himself upright and brushed frost from his jacket. Like I said, he added, I fix things for a living. You can keep pretending you do not need help, but your ship definitely does. The Queen turned her head just a fraction more than before, and for the briefest moment Daniel caught a clearer glimpse of those golden eyes reflecting the pale light of the frozen sky. And still she refused to fully look at him. Daniel Carter let the silence sit between them like frost settling on metal. The wind moved slowly across the landing field, whispering along the curved surface of the royal starship, while loose grains of ice slid across the ground with a dry scratching sound. He had seen that look before in captains and diplomats who passed through the outer systems. The careful pause when someone realized the situation was not unfolding the way they expected. Only this time it belonged to a queen who ruled an empire spanning dozens of worlds. Daniel pushed his hands into the pockets of his jacket and waited. Machines taught patience better than people ever could. Eventually something always revealed itself. Lysera remained perfectly still for several seconds, but the soldiers behind her were beginning to shift their weight subtly, the faint movement of armor joints clicking softly. In the cold air, they were not nervous. They were simply uncertain, and uncertainty did not belong in royal escort formations. Finally, the Queen spoke again, her voice calm and level. You seem confident in your assessment of a vessel you have never inspected. Daniel gave a small shrug and glanced up at the ship's dorsal ridge where faint blue lights pulsed unevenly beneath the armor plating. Confidence comes from patterns, he said. Your guidance array tried to stabilize during descent, but the signal drifted every few seconds. That usually means the alignment rings inside the navigation core shifted during jump compression. It happens when the system recalibrates too quickly after leaving hyperspace. One of the soldiers turned his helmet slightly toward the ship, as if confirming the observation. Daniel continued speaking in the same relaxed tone. The fix is simple. The rings need to be realigned manually, and the calibration cycle restarted. 10 minutes if the system cooperates. Maybe 30 if it decides to be stubborn. The wind gusted across the landing field again, tugging gently at the long strands of Lysera's silver hair. This time she took another step forward without hesitation. The distance between them narrowed again, now close enough that Daniel could see the faint reflection of the outpost lights shimmering along the edges of her armor. Yet even now her gaze remained angled just past him, resting somewhere near the horizon. Daniel tilted his head slightly. You know, he said thoughtfully, most people would at least look at the mechanic before deciding whether to trust him. Lysera did not respond immediately. Her expression remained composed, almost distant, but her next words carried a quiet weight beneath them. Trust is not the question. Daniel raised an eyebrow. No. Then what is? Another moment passed before she answered. The answer was softer than the wind moving through the landing field. Distance. Daniel frowned slightly, not quite understanding. He had expected suspicion, maybe even pride. Distance was not a response he had heard before. Behind the Queen, the starship released a low mechanical pulse as internal systems shifted into standby mode, the sound rolling across the frozen ground like distant thunder beneath the ice. Daniel exhaled slowly, watching the vapor of his breath fade into the cold air. Well, he said at last, that is unfortunate timing, because if you want that navigation system fixed, you are going to have to stand a lot closer than this. For the first time since she stepped off the ship, Lysera turned her head a fraction more toward him, and Daniel caught the clearest glimpse yet of those golden eyes. And still, somehow, she refused to meet his gaze directly. Daniel Carter watched the alien Queen carefully after her last words settled into the cold air between them. Distance. That was the word she had chosen, and it hung there strangely, like a warning that had not fully explained itself. The wind slid across the landing field again, rattling the loose panel on the outpost roof, while the massive royal starship behind her released another low mechanical hum as its internal systems shifted into standby mode. Daniel rubbed his gloved hands together slowly and glanced toward the dark clouds building along the horizon. The storm front was moving faster now. The scanner inside the outpost had not been exaggerating. Within a few hours, the sky would bury this entire valley under snow and ice thick enough to hide a landing ship twice that size. He looked back at Lysera and gave a small nod toward the starship. Your navigation system is not going to fix itself, he said calmly. And once that storm hits, the atmospheric interference will make diagnostics nearly impossible. The Queen did not answer immediately. Her posture remained perfectly controlled, but Daniel noticed something subtle again. She had stepped closer without realizing it. The distance between them was now less than 6 yards. Close enough that the faint glow of her skin reflected against the frost on the ground between them. Close enough that Daniel could hear the quiet rhythm of the ship's cooling systems cycling through their power grid. The soldiers behind her were beginning to glance at one another now, silent communication passing between them. Not fear, not urgency, just quiet confusion. Their queen was still standing outside in the freezing wind, speaking with a human mechanic instead of giving orders. Daniel shifted his weight and spoke again, his tone patient but firm. Look, Your Majesty, I understand if trusting a stranger on a backwater ice world is not your preferred strategy. But I promise you I have repaired ships a lot bigger than that one. He gestured casually toward the towering vessel behind her. A small flicker of movement crossed Lysera's expression, almost too brief to notice. Then she finally spoke again. Your confidence is unusual. Daniel chuckled softly under his breath. Confidence keeps machines running and people alive out here. Doubt just leaves you stranded. For several seconds the Queen studied the frozen ground beside him, as if weighing something far more complicated than a damaged navigation array. Then she slowly turned her head a little more than before. Not enough to meet his eyes directly, but enough that her attention shifted closer to him than the distant mountains she had been pretending to study since she arrived. Daniel felt the change immediately. There was a strange tension in the air now, subtle but undeniable, like static building before a lightning strike. Finally Lysera spoke again, her voice lower this time. If you enter the vessel to repair the system, you will be within the Royal Command Corridor. Daniel shrugged. Sounds like a hallway with expensive lighting. She continued without reacting to the humor. No human has ever been invited there. Daniel tilted his head slightly and looked back at the starship, then at her again. First time for everything, he said. The wind swept across the landing field once more, carrying loose ice crystals past their feet. Lysera took one final step closer. For the briefest moment her golden eyes almost aligned with his. And then, just before their gazes could meet, she looked away again. The wind had begun to change direction by the time Daniel Carter stepped toward the lowered ramp of the royal starship, carrying with it a deeper chill that crawled through the seams of his jacket and settled into his bones. He had lived on this frozen world long enough to recognize the warning signs. The storm was coming faster now. Above them the gray clouds were thickening into a heavy ceiling that swallowed the pale sunlight and turned the entire valley into a field of dull silver. Daniel stopped at the base of the ramp and glanced back over his shoulder. Queen Lysera stood only a few yards behind him now, her tall silhouette calm and unmoving while the soldiers maintained their quiet formation further back. Even with the distance closed between them, she still refused to meet his eyes. Daniel exhaled slowly, watching the cloud of his breath drift away. Well, he said in a relaxed tone, if I am going to be the first human mechanic to walk through your command corridor, I suppose I should make a good impression. He reached into the small tool pack hanging from his shoulder and pulled out a compact diagnostic scanner, the device lighting up with a soft blue glow as it powered on. The ramp beneath his boots hummed faintly with stored energy, a sign that the vessel's internal systems were still operating well within normal range despite the navigation failure. Daniel stepped inside. The difference in temperature was immediate. Warm air moved quietly through hidden vents along the corridor walls, carrying the faint sterile scent of advanced filtration systems and polished metal. The interior lighting was soft but precise, thin lines of pale white illumination running along the curved architecture of the passageway, like veins of light through stone. Daniel looked around with quiet appreciation. Whoever designed this ship had cared about symmetry and silence. Even the floor beneath his boots absorbed sound so completely that each step felt like walking across calm water. He knelt near a maintenance console along the wall and opened the access panel with a practiced motion, the magnetic locks releasing with a soft click. The scanner in his hand immediately began reading the system signals flowing through the exposed conduits. Just as he suspected, the guidance rings inside the navigation array had drifted out of phase during the ship's last hyperspace transition. The correction algorithm had tried to compensate, but ended up locking the system into a repeating recalibration loop. Nothing dangerous, just inconvenient for a ship that needed precise jump coordinates. Daniel worked calmly, fingers moving through the interface while the scanner translated alien code structures into something he could interpret. After a moment, he spoke without turning around. "You can come closer, you know. I am not contagious." There was a faint shift of movement behind him as Lysera entered the corridor. He could feel her presence immediately, not through sound, but through the subtle change in the air itself, like standing near a quiet but powerful current. She stopped several steps behind him, still careful, still maintaining that strange distance she had insisted on since the moment she arrived. Daniel continued adjusting the calibration sequence, the console lights reflecting faintly across the metal tools in his hands. "You have been avoiding looking at me since you landed," he said calmly. "That has to be one of the more unusual reactions I have received from royalty. Most of them stare like I am a curiosity in a museum." Silence answered him for several seconds. Then Lysera spoke softly behind him. "It is not avoidance." Daniel smiled faintly while tightening the final calibration lock. "Then what is it?" The Queen's voice came quieter this time, carrying a strange honesty that did not belong in royal corridors. "It is restraint." Daniel Carter tightened the final calibration lock inside the open console and listened as the navigation system responded with a low harmonic tone that rolled softly through the corridor walls. The sound was subtle but satisfying, the mechanical equivalent of a deep breath after a long pause. The recalibration sequence began running through its cycle, pale blue indicators sliding steadily across the display panel in front of him. Outside the hull, the distant wind pressed against the ship like slow ocean waves against steel, but inside the corridor, everything remained calm and controlled. Daniel brushed a thin layer of frost from his gloves where the cold tools had touched them earlier and leaned back slightly on one knee. "Restraint," he repeated quietly, letting the words settle in the warm air between them. "That is a new one. Most people either avoid me or tolerate me. You are the first queen who claims to be restraining herself from looking at a mechanic." Behind him, Lysera remained silent for several seconds. Daniel could feel her presence more clearly now that they stood inside the ship's enclosed corridor. It was not threatening. It was something quieter and heavier, like standing near a slow-moving current beneath still water. Finally, she spoke again. "Your species is unusual." Daniel gave a soft laugh under his breath and continued adjusting a few final values on the interface screen. "That is one of the nicer descriptions I have heard. Usually the word reckless appears somewhere in the sentence." The recalibration indicators reached 60% and continued climbing. The guidance rings deeper within the ship were rotating back into phase alignment now, each one adjusting its position through magnetic stabilizers designed to hold perfect symmetry during hyperspace navigation. Daniel glanced back over his shoulder for the first time since beginning the repair. Lysera stood only a few steps away, her posture straight and composed as always, silver hair resting gently along the edges of her armor where the corridor lights reflected across the metallic plates. And still she had positioned herself carefully so that her golden eyes did not fully meet his. Daniel studied her for a moment with open curiosity. "You know," he said calmly, "if you keep standing at that exact angle, it is going to make conversation a little awkward." The Queen did not move. The navigation display reached 75%, and the system released another low harmonic pulse through the walls. Daniel watched the numbers climb while waiting for her response. When she finally spoke again, her voice carried a quiet weight beneath it. "Our species forms bonds differently than humans." Daniel tilted his head slightly, fingers resting loosely against the edge of the console. "Bonds? That sounds serious." Lysera continued speaking with careful precision, each word chosen as if it carried consequences. "Among my people, connection is not temporary. When it forms, it is permanent." Daniel considered that for a moment. "That sounds like marriage," he said lightly. Lysera did not respond to the humor. Instead, she continued, "Our biology responds strongly to certain signals. Eye contact among them." Daniel slowly turned his body around so that he faced her fully now, resting one shoulder against the console while the repair sequence continued behind him. So if you look directly at someone, you bond with them. The Queen remained silent for a moment before answering. It begins the process. The navigation system display reached 90%. Daniel let out a quiet breath and gave a thoughtful nod. Well, that explains the distance. He glanced toward the glowing interface behind him. Almost finished. When he looked back at her again, his expression softened slightly with curiosity. But now I have a new question. If that is how your species works, why did you walk inside the corridor with me at all? The navigation system display behind Daniel Carter reached 98%, and the corridor filled with a soft harmonic vibration as the final guidance ring slid back into alignment deep inside the starship's core. The sound was almost musical, a steady resonance that traveled through the polished floor beneath his boots and up through the metal console he leaned against. Daniel watched the last progress bar slowly approach completion, but his attention kept drifting back to the quiet figure standing a few steps away from him. Queen Lysera remained perfectly still, her posture balanced with the calm discipline of someone accustomed to command, yet the tension around her was impossible to miss now that he understood what she had been trying to avoid. Daniel folded his arms loosely and studied her with thoughtful curiosity. He had repaired ships in pirate docks, mining stations, and orbital junkyards across half the outer systems. But this conversation was easily the strangest diagnostic session he had ever experienced. Finally, the system chimed once, a clear tone that signaled the recalibration cycle had completed successfully. The display panel shifted from warning amber to steady blue, and a new line of data appeared confirming stable navigation lock. Daniel nodded with quiet satisfaction and closed the access panel with a soft click. That should do it, he said calmly. Your guidance rings are aligned again, and the navigation core can finally calculate a proper jump route. The ship should be able to leave orbit whenever you are ready. He brushed a trace of dust from his gloves and turned back toward Lysera fully. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The warm air inside the corridor hummed quietly through the ventilation channels, while the faint glow of the ship's internal lighting reflected along the smooth curves of the royal armor she wore. Daniel noticed something else now that he was facing her directly. Even though she avoided his eyes, she had gradually moved closer during the entire repair process. The distance between them was no longer 6 yards, or even 4. It was barely 2 steps. Close enough that he could see subtle variations in the blue tone of her skin where the light shifted across it. Close enough to hear the quiet rhythm of her breathing beneath the calm surface of her composure. Daniel tilted his head slightly, curiosity returning to his expression. You never answered my question, he said gently. If eye contact can start a bond for your species, then walking into this corridor with me was a pretty big risk. Lysera remained silent for a long moment. Her gaze stayed carefully angled toward the wall behind him, as if the smooth metallic panels were suddenly the most fascinating thing in the universe. Then she finally spoke, her voice softer than before, but still steady. Because the storm outside will trap us here for several hours. Daniel blinked once and glanced toward the sealed outer hatch, as if he could somehow see through the layers of alloy and insulation. A low rumble of distant wind confirmed what she was saying. The storm had already arrived. He turned back toward her with a slow smile forming at the corner of his mouth. So you decided repairing the ship was worth the risk. Lysera hesitated for the first time since he had met her. When she finally answered, her voice carried a quiet honesty that did not belong in royal declarations. No, she said softly. The risk was already there the moment I stepped off the ship. The corridor remained quiet after Lysera's last words, the gentle hum of the starship's systems filling the silence like distant wind moving through metal canyons. Daniel Carter stood still for a moment, letting what she had said settle in his mind. The risk had already existed the moment she stepped off the ship. That meant whatever strange biological bond her species feared had not started here inside the corridor. It had begun earlier, outside in the frozen landing field when she first saw him standing alone beside the outpost. Daniel slowly rubbed the back of his neck and let out a thoughtful breath. Outside the hull, the storm had fully arrived now. The wind battered the ship with long rolling gusts that made the outer structure vibrate faintly, a deep steady sound that traveled through the corridor floor like the distant rumble of ocean waves beneath ice. Snow and frozen particles scraped across the hull in a constant whisper, sealing the entire valley in white silence. Daniel glanced toward the sealed hatch, and then back at the Queen standing only a few feet away. "So the storm keeps us here," he said calmly. "And your ship is fixed. That leaves us with time and an awkward conversation about alien biology." Lysera remained composed, but something in the air between them had shifted. The tension that had filled the corridor earlier was softer now, replaced by a quiet awareness neither of them seemed willing to break. Daniel leaned casually against the console again, arms loosely folded. "When exactly did this risk start?" he asked. Lysera did not answer immediately. Her gaze remained carefully directed toward the wall beside him. But Daniel could see the faint movement of her breathing slow and steady beneath the smooth plates of her armor. Finally she spoke. "When I first observed you." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Observe me doing what?" "You were repairing the outpost power relay in the snow." Daniel let out a small laugh. "That hardly sounds like a romantic moment." Lysera did not react to the humor. Instead her voice remained calm and precise. "You were alone in extreme weather conditions attempting to repair equipment that did not belong to you." Daniel shrugged lightly. "That is my job." She continued, speaking quietly. "Most individuals would have retreated inside the structure. You remained outside until the repair was complete." Daniel thought about that for a moment. The wind outside roared louder against the hull as the storm intensified, the sound echoing softly through the ventilation channels. "When something breaks," he said slowly, "it bothers me until it works again. Machines deserve to function properly." Lysera remained silent for a few seconds before answering. That was when the bond response began. Daniel blinked once and straightened slightly from the console. "Hold on. You are telling me your species starts bonding because someone fixes a power relay in bad weather." Lysera finally shifted her posture, just enough that her attention moved closer to him than the wall she had been studying. "It is not the repair," she said quietly. "It is the intent." Daniel frowned slightly, curiosity growing. "Intent?" "Yes." The Queen's voice softened almost imperceptibly. "Among my people, loyalty to function is one of the strongest signals of compatibility." Daniel looked at her for a long moment, the quiet hum of the repaired navigation system filling the corridor around them. Then he shook his head slowly with a faint smile. "Well, that explains something," he said. Lysera remained still. Daniel exhaled softly and added, "Because I was wondering why the queen of an entire empire followed a mechanic into a hallway, instead of flying away the moment the repair was finished." Daniel Carter's faint smile lingered for a moment after his last words, but the quiet corridor did not answer with laughter. The storm outside had grown stronger, the wind striking the hull in long, steady waves that made the ship vibrate almost imperceptibly beneath their feet. Somewhere deeper in the vessel, the recalibrated navigation rings finished their final alignment cycle, and the harmonic tone faded into a stable background hum. Everything inside the ship was now perfectly functional again, which meant the only unresolved system. In the corridor was the conversation, standing 2 steps in front of him. Lysera remained still for several seconds after Daniel spoke. Her gaze continued to rest somewhere near his shoulder rather than his eyes, but the careful distance she had maintained earlier had quietly disappeared. The two of them now stood close enough that the corridor lights reflected clearly along the silver strands of her hair and across the faint luminous patterns beneath the surface of her skin. Daniel noticed something else as well. The calm composure she carried like armor had begun to shift. Not collapse, just soften slightly, the way ice begins to melt along the edges before anyone notices the temperature changing. Finally she spoke, "Because leaving immediately would not change the bond response." Daniel nodded slowly as if the answer confirmed something he had already suspected. "So you stayed because it had already started." Lysera inclined her head just slightly in acknowledgement. "The biological process does not reverse once initiated." Daniel leaned his shoulder more comfortably against the console behind him and folded his arms again. For someone who spent most of his life repairing machines, he found alien biology unexpectedly interesting when explained this way. "And how strong is this process?" he asked. Lysera answered without hesitation. "Among my people, it defines our closest partnerships and leadership structures. The bond ensures loyalty, cooperation, and emotional synchronization between individuals." Daniel blinked once. "Emotional synchronization. That sounds serious." "It is." The Queen's voice remained steady but quieter now, almost reflective. "Once fully formed, it lasts for life." Daniel let out a low whistle beneath his breath. "Well, that is impressive efficiency." Humans usually need years of complicated conversation to reach the same result. The faintest trace of amusement passed across Lysera's expression before disappearing again beneath her usual composure. The corridor lighting flickered slightly as the storm outside intensified, but the ship's internal systems compensated instantly, and the glow stabilized again. Daniel pushed himself upright from the console and walked a slow circle around the maintenance station, stretching the stiffness from his shoulders after kneeling beside the interface for so long. When he turned back toward her, his tone had grown more thoughtful. "There is just one thing I still do not understand." Lysera waited quietly. Daniel continued, "If your species' knows eye contact can trigger the strongest stage of the bond, then you have been very careful not to look directly at me since you arrived." Lysera remained silent. Daniel gestured lightly toward the corridor between them. "Yet you still followed me into this hallway and stood a few feet away while I repaired your ship." He paused before finishing the thought. "Which means you accepted the risk even before the storm trapped us here." For the first time since they met, Lysera slowly turned her head fully toward him. Her golden eyes lifted at last, meeting Daniel's gaze directly for a single steady moment. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried no hesitation at all. "Because I wanted to know if the bond would choose you as well." For the first time since Daniel Carter met her, Queen Lysera looked directly into his eyes, and the quiet corridor seemed to change in that instant, as if the ship itself had noticed the shift. The golden light in her gaze was steady and unguarded now, no longer angled toward the wall or the distant floor panels. Daniel felt the moment before he fully understood it, a subtle awareness settling into the space between them like warmth spreading through cold metal. Outside the hull, the storm roared across the frozen valley, wind and ice striking the ship in relentless waves. But inside the command corridor, everything remained strangely calm. Daniel held her gaze without moving. For a man who had spent most of his life alone with broken machinery and silent repair stations, eye contact was usually just another part of conversation. But this felt different, not overwhelming, not frightening, just unexpectedly clear, like seeing a pattern fall into place after hours of staring at tangled wiring. Lysera spoke first, her voice quieter than before, but no longer restrained. "The bond response confirms mutual compatibility through neural synchronization." Daniel raised one eyebrow slightly, but did not break eye contact. "That sounds like a very complicated way of saying we get along." A faint trace of amusement touched the corner of Lysera's expression, subtle but unmistakable. "Among my people, the process is rarely simple." Daniel shifted his weight slightly and glanced briefly at the navigation console behind him, where the repaired systems continued running perfectly stable. The ship was ready to leave orbit whenever the storm cleared, which meant the practical part of the situation was already solved. Only the unexpected part remained. He looked back at her. "So what happens now?" he asked calmly. Lysera did not look away. "Once the bond is acknowledged, it strengthens through continued proximity and shared intent." Daniel let out a quiet breath that might have been a laugh. "Shared intent. That is another impressive phrase. On Earth we usually call that spending time together." Lysera considered that translation for a moment. It is not entirely inaccurate. The storm outside intensified again, a deep rolling gust striking the hull with enough force to make the corridor lights flicker softly before stabilizing once more. Daniel glanced toward the sealed hatch and shook his head slightly. "Well, it looks like the universe is giving us plenty of proximity for the next few hours." When he turned back toward her, his expression had softened with genuine curiosity rather than surprise. "You know something," he said. "Most people would probably panic if a queen from another species told them they were part of a permanent biological bond." Lysera tilted her head slightly. "Yet you appear calm." Daniel shrugged lightly. "I spend my life fixing machines in places where help rarely arrives." You learn to accept unusual situations without overthinking them. He paused briefly before adding with a faint smile. Besides, if the bond is based on intent, then I suppose the real question is simple. Lysera waited. Daniel met her gaze steadily and finished the thought. What exactly do you intend to do about it? Lysera did not answer Daniel Carter immediately after his question. The corridor remained quiet except for the soft hum of the starship systems and the distant roar of the storm striking the outer hull. Snow and ice scraped along the ship's armor like dry sand against metal, a constant whisper that reminded them both the valley outside had disappeared beneath a white wall of wind. Yet inside the command corridor the air felt strangely calm, as if the ship itself had decided this moment was more important than the storm raging beyond its walls. Lysera continued holding Daniel's gaze without hesitation now. The restraint she had maintained since stepping off the ship was gone, replaced by something steadier and more honest. For the first time since he had met her, she did not appear like a distant ruler observing a curious human. She looked like someone thinking carefully about a choice that would shape more than just the next few hours. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but certain. Among my people, the formation of a bond is not treated as an accident. It is acknowledged and respected. Daniel listened without interrupting, leaning one shoulder against the console while the repaired navigation display glowed steadily behind him. Lysera continued. The bond creates a shared awareness of intention. It does not remove individual choice, but it encourages cooperation. Daniel nodded slowly. That sounds more reasonable than I expected. Lysera tilted her head slightly. You expected something else. Daniel gave a small shrug. Considering you rule an empire that spans half a sector, I assumed the biological bond might immediately involve royal ceremonies or complicated diplomatic consequences. For a brief moment, Lysera seemed amused by that possibility. Such decisions are rarely immediate. The bond itself is only the beginning. Daniel folded his arms thoughtfully. Beginning of what? Lysera took one slow step closer, reducing the distance between them to less than a foot now. Her golden eyes remained steady on his, calm and open in a way that would have been impossible only minutes earlier. The beginning of understanding whether the connection strengthens or fades. Daniel considered that answer carefully. Outside the ship, the storm howled louder, a heavy gust rolling across the hull and causing the corridor lights to dim for a fraction of a second before stabilizing again. The navigation system behind him remained perfectly aligned, quietly ready for departure the moment the sky cleared. He glanced toward the console once more before returning his attention to her. So the bond does not force anything. It just opens the possibility. Lysera nodded once. Exactly. Daniel exhaled slowly and allowed a small, thoughtful smile to form. In that case, the situation is simpler than it first sounded. Lysera waited. Daniel straightened from the console and looked directly at her. You asked what I intend to do about it. His voice remained calm and steady. I intend to see where it goes. Lysera studied him for a long moment, the quiet hum of the ship surrounding them both. Then something subtle changed in her expression, not dramatic or overwhelming. Just a quiet shift that made her seem less like a distant queen and more like someone relieved to hear an answer she had hoped for. Outside, the storm continued to rage across the frozen valley, but inside the corridor, the silence between them had become something entirely different from before. The storm continued to roar across the frozen valley outside the royal starship, but inside the command corridor the air felt calm in a way Daniel Carter had not expected when the day began. The navigation systems behind him remained perfectly stable now, a steady blue glow pulsing across the console display as the recalibrated guidance rings held their precise alignment deep within the ship's core. Everything that had been broken was fixed. The mission that brought the Queen to this remote ice world could continue the moment the storm cleared. Yet neither of them moved toward the exit hatch. Lysera remained standing close to him, her golden eyes still resting steadily on his without the distance she had kept since landing. Daniel noticed the difference immediately. The Queen who had stepped off the ship hours earlier had carried the quiet gravity of someone who ruled star systems. The woman standing in front of him now carried that same strength, but there was something warmer behind it, something less guarded. Daniel rested his hands lightly against the edge of the console and looked at her with the same calm curiosity he had carried through the entire strange conversation. Outside the hull, the wind howled across the metal plating in long, powerful gusts, but the corridor lights remained steady and soft, reflecting along the curved architecture of the royal vessel. It is interesting, Daniel said after a moment. Lysera waited quietly. Most people who arrive on this world are trying to leave as quickly as possible. Yet you repaired the problem that would let you depart and still chose to remain inside this hallway with a mechanic. Lysera considered that observation before answering. The storm will pass soon. Daniel nodded slightly. Yes, it will. He glanced toward the sealed hatch for a moment, as if imagining the valley buried beneath swirling snow, then looked back at her again. And when it does, Your ship will be able to leave orbit and return to whatever important responsibilities await a queen of the Orinth Dominion. Lysera did not look away. That is true. Daniel studied her expression carefully. The bond you described earlier does not disappear when distance returns, does it? Lysera answered without hesitation. No. Daniel exhaled slowly and allowed a thoughtful smile to form. That means whatever this connection becomes will have to exist across more than one frozen valley. Lysera took a single step closer, her voice calm but sincere. Distance does not weaken the bond once it forms. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, the quiet hum of the starship surrounding them both. For someone who spent most of his life repairing broken machines in forgotten corners of space, the idea that a queen from another world had just chosen to accept a permanent connection with him would have sounded impossible only a day earlier. Yet the strange thing was how natural it felt now. He finally nodded once. Well then, Your Majesty, it seems the universe has introduced us in a rather unusual way. Lysera's expression softened slightly. Daniel pushed himself away from the console and glanced once more at the stable navigation display. The storm outside will clear soon, he said quietly. When it does, you will have a choice to make. Lysera held his gaze steadily. Daniel met her eyes with the same calm certainty he had carried since the moment she stepped off her ship. Whatever choice you make, he added, I suspect this is only the beginning.